who lived through some very strange days as well, and the lessons they learned, the things that they did as a result of that changed everything. So I hope you'll be here with us for that. Now, that's this Sunday, the 13th. Now, 1 week later, on the 20th, not this Sunday, but the following Sunday, we're going to be having some form of, and I don't know all the details yet, still trying to work out what we can and cannot do, but we're going to have some form of our annual kickoff Sunday. Now, it may be that all we can do is everybody wear their favorite team colors. And if that's all we can do, you know what? We're going to enjoy that and have fun with that. But maybe we'll be able to do more. We're still looking into that and trying to figure all that out. But that'll be coming up on the 20th. We're just ready to see some people and see some smiling faces and enjoy being with our church family. So I hope you're making your plans to be here on the 13th. Now, one other thing I'll mention to you, one of the things that we've been trying to develop, and most of you know on Wednesdays and Sundays, it's usually just myself and Stephen here. And on Wednesday nights, it's just me, and Zachary is always here, and he does the live streaming. One of the things he's been working on is creating a YouTube account for our church and being able to live stream these messages and archive them there as well. So you may see that very soon. He's hoping that's working right now. We can't put the entire services on YouTube because of the fact we can't do music because of all the copyright issues. So it'll just be sermons. But it'll be a place eventually where you can go, and if you want to go back and watch a sermon that maybe was meaningful to you or something you want to share with somebody else, you'll be able to do that, and we'll say more about that in the coming days. But tonight, again, one last time, I want to come back to this series. Kind of wrapping up a lot of things we've been doing, getting ready for a fresh start this coming Sunday. And so just as we wrapped up our Sunday morning series, I want to wrap up our Sunday night series tonight. Now, here's what we've been doing on Wednesday night. Here's what we've been doing on Wednesday nights for the last couple of months. We've been talking about being a disciple. Not a Christian, but a disciple. As I've said over and over, you can have a moment of salvation and you can wind up in heaven without ever trying to really closely follow in the footsteps and the teachings of Jesus. You can do that. It's not what you ought to do. It's not what I ought to do, but we can. What I've been trying to challenge myself and all of us to do is to take it to the next step and say, you know what? What would it look like to actually follow in His steps? And that's what a disciple is. A disciple was someone who followed a rabbi around and learned from them and emulated them and tried in every way possible to make their life look like the teacher's life. And that's what Jesus asked us to do, to follow Him, to follow in His footsteps, follow in His teachings, follow in His attitude, follow in His actions, follow in everything, and be like Him. Now, for the last several weeks, we've been talking about these different traits that if we're going to be a disciple, that there are certain things that are going to have to be a part of our life. And I'll say one last time tonight what I've said every single week. This is not about learning a verse. This is not about checking off a box on a checklist and saying, okay, well, I know what that is, so I got that. It's not that. This is about taking these ideas and making them a natural part of who we are. That's the idea. Is to understand, okay, these are some of the traits that were true of Jesus. And if I'm going to be a follower of Him, if I'm going to be like Him, these things need to be a natural part of who I am as well. Now, we started off by talking about faith. Faith. Because that's where everything in the spiritual life starts, faith. Faith is believing in something you don't totally understand, believing it so strongly that it changes how you live your life. Now, as I've said repeatedly, you'll never stay involved in your spiritual life without faith. Because there's going to be some things in life that are going to come along that you won't fully understand. There's going to be some things happen. There's going to be losses, there's going to be setbacks, there's going to be circumstances, and you're going to say, well, I don't understand why God is allowing that in my life. Without faith, you'll fall by the wayside. You got to have faith. And then we talked about commitment. Commitment is a dedication to a cause, to a purpose, or to a person. Again, you'll never stay in. You can get into church world, but you will never stay in church world without commitment. Without commitment, it'll just be like a fad diet. It'll be like January the 1st when we say, hey, this is the time I'm really going to lose weight this time, and it lasts a couple of weeks and then we're back to our old habits. It takes commitment. It takes an absolute dedication of yourself saying, no matter what happens, I'm in this. And then we talked about hunger, spiritual hunger. Spiritual hunger is what feeds the commitment. What is it that gives people the motivation to really change their life? It's a hunger to get to a goal. The hunger feeds the commitment. And without spiritual hunger to really obtain this relationship with God, we'll never have the commitment and we'll never have the staying power that we're supposed to have. And then we talked about worship. Worship is having those moments in life that kind of recharge our spiritual batteries. And they're so important because it's real easy in life to kind of get down, to get discouraged, especially in days like this that we're living in. So every once in a while, you need those worship moments where you see God for who He is, see yourself for who you are, and are challenged to do better. Worship. And as I've said, worship can happen in church. It can happen in your car, driving down the road. It can happen in bed, laying there at night. It can happen anywhere, anytime, in any set of circumstances. Maybe it's a song, maybe it's a sermon, maybe it's just seeing your children or your grandchildren, but all of a sudden, you're reminded of how good God's been to you. Worship. And then we talked about having a servant's heart, a willingness to put others first, a willingness to serve others instead of expecting to be served ourselves. We talked about not taking offense, that one of the things you can't do in church world is always be offended. Now listen, there's a lot of things that I don't know, but I can tell you this. You can't be a pastor for as long as I've been a pastor without learning. You just can't get offended all the time. Because if you do, if everything people do, if every decision people make offends you, you're just gonna stay discouraged all the time. You have to learn to just let some things go and remember, you know what? I'm only answerable to God for what I do, not for what somebody else does. So I'm not going to get offended by what they do or don't do, by what they say or don't say. That's between them and Him. I'm answerable for me. And then we talked about the words of our mouth. How the things that we say, and not just the words we say, but the way we say them, the way we talk to people, the way we interact with people. Are we encouraging? Or are we destructive with our words? How that's such an impactful thing, not just on our testimony and our influence, but what people think about Christianity in general. And then we talked about one of my favorite topics, attitude. I've been talking about attitude for almost 30 years. Attitude, that outward expression of an inward emotion. And we talked about, look, if you want to stay in this thing, have a good attitude. Have a little joy in your heart. Have a little happiness. Don't go through life with a frown on your face and always upset and always angry and always, critical about everything and everybody, but find some joy in life. And then last week, we talked about compassion. Compassion is this two-step thing we talked about. It's when you see someone else going through something, but it's more than seeing it. It's more than knowing about it. It's being so moved by it that you're compelled to act on their behalf. That's compassion. Compassion is when you say, like the Good Samaritan who saw the man that had been beaten and robbed, hey, I see what you're going through, but I'm also going to help you. I'm not just going to walk by and say, well, hey, brother, hope everything works out. Hey, I'll be praying for you. No. I'm going to do what I can to help you. Well, those are the things we've talked about up to this point. And tonight, we're going to conclude by talking about the glue that holds the whole thing together. And that's love. This is the thing that makes all these other things possible. You cannot do all these other things unless, number one, you love the Lord, and number two, you learn to love others. And you learn to love them as they are. Not as you want them to be, not as you think they ought to be, but you learn to love them as they are. Aren't you glad that God loved you when you were just you? I'm certainly glad He loved me. He didn't say, hey, if you'll straighten up and do this, this, and this, then I'll love you. The Bible says He loved us first. He loved us before we ever loved Him. And we will never, ever walk in the steps of Jesus until we learn to love Him and love others like He did. Because that is the thing that drives it all. You won't have compassion without love. You won't have commitment without love. You won't have spiritual hunger without love. You won't be able to not take offense without love. You won't be able to have a good attitude about anything without love. It just drives everything. Now, every week I've tried to give you a good working definition of what these terms are. And let me give you one for love. But before I tell you what love is, let's talk for a minute about what love is not. Because sometimes it's helpful to remind ourselves what something isn't. And especially with the word love. Because love is such a buzzword, it's such a common word, that a lot of people assume, well, this is what it is. Well, let me tell you what love is not. Number one, love is not an emotion. That's not what love is. Now, I know out in the world, in culture and entertainment, in the movies, a lot of times people think, well, it's love because I feel something. I get the butterflies, or I get the oogly googlies, or whatever you want to call it. That's how I know I'm in love. I've often told the story that whenever I marry a young couple, I always sit down and talk to them a time or two, and never fails that when a young couple that's, probably in their early 20s, or whatever, they're about to get married and they're so excited and they're so in love, and they come in my office and they sit there and they can't keep their eyes off each other and they're holding hands and touching each other. And it just makes you want to throw up, right? I mean, it's just, you know what I'm saying. That's not what love is. Because if that's all love is, then 50% of marriages wouldn't end in divorce in less than 18 months. You got to ask the question, if love is an emotion, well, then why does it dry up so quickly for so many people? Love is more than that. Love is not an emotion. And secondly, love is not words. Some people think just because they say it, then that proves it. Well, I love you. Well, talk is cheap. Just because you say it doesn't make it so. Love is not about saying the right words. Love is not about feeling the right emotion. Let me give you a couple of things from the Bible about what love actually is. Number one, according to the Bible, love is a verb. It's a verb. Love is action. It's not a noun. It's a verb. Love is doing something. In fact, what does the Bible say? Most famous verse in the Bible, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He, what? He did something. He gave His only begotten Son. Go to 1 John 3:16. And those verses are so important. John 3:16, 1 John 3:16. 1 John 3:16 says, here's how we know that God loved us, that He gave His only Son. See, here's how you can tell if somebody loves you. When they act on your behalf. Love is action. It's not words, it's not a feeling, it's not an emotion, it's action. Secondly, the Bible makes clear love is a choice. It's up to us. See, I hear people say all the time, they'll say, well, I know I'm supposed to love everybody. There's some people I just can't love. Well, you can, because it's a choice. And I'm going to prove that to you here in just a few minutes. Whether or not you love people, that's up to you. You say, well, wait a minute, no, it's up to them. No, it's not up to them, it's up to you. And I'll demonstrate that in just a moment. And then the last thing that the Bible makes clear is that love is permanent. It never ends. See, we're under this illusion that you can say, well, I love so-and-so. You know, they're my best friend. And then a year later, well, I don't like them anymore. We don't. I used to love them. That idea of saying I used to love somebody, that is foreign to the biblical teaching of love. Love is permanent. Love is a choice. Love is a verb. It's action. So let me give you a very simple little definition of what love is. It is the willing, joyful choice to put the needs of others ahead of your own. That's love. And notice that word willing and that word joyful. It's not doing something and going, well, I don't, but I guess I'm going to have to. No, it's not that. It's saying, okay, you know what? I willingly, joyfully do this on behalf of someone else. I'm not being bribed. I'm not being coerced. I'm not being forced. I'm not being arm twisted. I want to do this for them. If you're listening tonight and you're a parent, you understand this. What would you not do for your children? I think about my two boys, and over the course of these last 20 plus years now, there is nothing I would not willfully, joyfully do for my sons to help them out in their life. Why? Because I love them. There's nothing that I wouldn't do for them. There's nothing that I wouldn't do for Rosemary. The people that you love, really love, you willingly, joyfully choose to put their needs ahead of yours. Isn't that what Jesus did? Isn't that the whole thing behind John 3:16? That God the Father and God the Son both willingly, joyfully chose to put our needs ahead of their needs. They looked down at us and saw our situation and said, we can help them. And we willingly and joyfully choose to do that. That's love. And without that, we're never going to make it very far in our spiritual journey. Let me give you a couple passages from the Bible that just kind of illustrate this thing of love very briefly. In John 13, This is the night before the crucifixion. Jesus is actually in the garden with the disciples. And listen to what he tells them. A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. Now notice a couple of things about that verse. It says a new what? A new suggestion I give to you? A new idea I give to you? No, what did Jesus say? This is a commandment. In other words, Jesus said, guys, I'm not suggesting you do this. I'm commanding that you love one another the way I've loved you. Now, you remember I said a few moments ago that love is a choice? And there may be some people out there that are going, well, no, wait just a minute now. There's just some people you just can't let no. It's up to you. You say, how do you know? Here's how I know. Because God never commands us to do something that's impossible for us to do. If Jesus said, I command you to love one another, then we can do it. We may not want to do it sometimes. We may not feel like it sometimes. But we can do it. It's a choice. It's up to us. And then in the very next verse, he said one of the most powerful statements in the Bible. By this shall all men know that ye are my what? My disciples, my followers. That you have love one to another. See, this whole series has been about being a follower, being a disciple, being someone who walks in the footsteps of Jesus. And then he came along and said, hey, this is how they'll know that that's what you are. Now listen to all the things he didn't say. He didn't say they'll know it by how many Bible verses you can quote. He didn't say they'll know it by how much money you give. He didn't say they'd know it by the way you dress or the way you serve or if you go to more church services than anybody else. He didn't say any of that. He said they'll know you're my follower because you love one another. Now by that criteria, there's a lot of people who assume that they're followers of Christ that aren't really living up to that. Because they are not known for being loving. Let me ask you, when people think about you, and I know that self-reflection can be a very difficult thing to do. Sometimes seeing the truth about ourselves is one of the hardest things in the world. But when people think about you, do you think they think of somebody who's a loving, kind, generous person? Because that's what we want. We want to live in such a way that we are known for loving one another. That's what Jesus said would be true of his followers. Now, let me give you one other passage very quickly, and we're going to close tonight. In 1 Corinthians 13, Paul talked about the issue of love. In fact, chapter 13 is often known as the chapter all about love. Listen to what he says. Though I speak with the tongues of man and of angels and have not charity, underline that word, I am become as sounding brass or as a tinkling cymbal. In the King James, here in chapter 13, Paul uses the word charity for the word love. You know what the word charity literally means? Love in action. In other words, again, he's making the point, love is a verb. All these things we said earlier. Now listen to what Paul says about love. He says, even though you say all the right things, if you're not doing it from a premise of love for one another, then it's a waste of time. That's not a popular teaching anymore, but it's still true. Paul said, what you say isn't nearly as important as the motivating factor of, is it coming from a heart of love behind it? And then he took it a step further. He said, and though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mystery and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could move mountains, and have not charity or love, I am nothing. Paul said, you can be the greatest preacher. You can be the greatest teacher. You can know more about the Bible than anybody else out there. But if you don't love people the way Jesus loved people, and if you don't treat people with love the way Jesus treated people with love, he said, then you're wasting your time. And again, that's not a popular view, but it's still a biblical view. And then he said one final thing in verse 3. He said, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity or love, it profiteth me nothing. Paul said, you can give more than anybody else gives. And we've talked about many times how the Pharisees in Jesus' day made a big show. They wanted everybody to know not only that they gave, but how much they gave. And Jesus talked about how much better it was to give secretly, to give in a way so that nobody ever knew. And Paul said, but you can do all that. But if you're not giving it because you love God, then you're wasting again your time. And then I want you to look at one other verse here in this same chapter. Down in verse 8, he says this, charity or love never faileth. I love those three words. They're so powerful. The word charity clearly means love. The word faileth comes from the idea of a rose withering away. You know, the last little leaf, the last little petal of the rose falling off and it dying. Here's what Paul was saying. What I said earlier. Love is permanent. Love never fails. Love never dies. Not if it's real. Not if it's genuine. Not if it's what it was supposed to be. And then at the very end of this chapter, and it's a very short chapter, but he says one other thing about love. He says, and now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. Now let me paraphrase. Paul said there's these three incredibly important attributes in the Christian life. Faith, hope, and love. And then he said this, the greatest, the most important is love. Now why is that? Because love is the one thing that will never end. Do you know there's going to come a day when faith and hope will go away? You won't need that anymore. When you get to heaven, when I get to heaven, I won't need faith anymore. Because when I stand in heaven, I won't have to hope something is true. I won't have to trust something is true. I will see that it's true, and faith will be no more. I won't have hope anymore. Our hope will have been realized when we get to heaven. But for all eternity, you know what we're still going to be doing? Loving one another. And that's why Paul said, listen, there's these three things. Faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Love is the engine that drives the spiritual life. Let's make much of it. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the time. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for those that have joined us tonight. And for the others that will watch this at a later time, we pray it'll be a blessing to them. And we ask it in your name. Amen.